first question is like, what is Dr. Gupta?
Sure. So Dr. Gupta is an AI doctor. The goal is that one day, I think that there actually won't be human doctors anymore. I think that we're going to live in a world, I don't know what year that is, if it's 2040 or 2050 or 2150, but I think that we'll live in a world where the idea of a doctor will be passe or antiquated or anachronistic. And, there'll be our kids or great grandkids or whatever generation will say, I can't believe that there was a person in charge of your health and you would go miles to go visit this person and they were like really revered and you pay them a lot of money and they would come up with the right solution and they'll laugh at it the same way we laugh at other anachronisms. And I think that AI is a big part of that. What OpenAI has done and similar companies is just astounding. If you haven't interacted with ChatGPT, I've seen some studies that show that physicians are interacting with ChatGPT every day.
It scored like above 90% of the USMLE Step 1, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and we are at the forefront of different techniques to get the most out of GPT. Not all GPT is created equal. So like there's some papers out there.
You have to train it, right?
Well, it's training, fine tuning, but also it's almost like it's such a weird ghost in a machine. But we've done all these different algorithms. We have one really good one up our sleeve that's not part of Gupta, but hopefully will be soon. But like, for example, the big one is called tree of thought or chain of thought. So if you string together these prompts and their results, which is what Gupta does, you can kind of create this semi-sentience, which is really eerie and kind of remarkable. And the other thing that GPT doesn't do that we do is you have to give it a memory. So we have, like many others, we have this like vector store that allows the Gupta to remember everything he knows about you. And the other thing we do is we feed it new stories and new articles from PubMed every day. So you have this like kind of like generic intellect that can really tackle health problems, which is really neat. And I think that doctors will always be around in a lot of ways, but I think that a lot of the questions we have for physicians, like, I don't know, just speaking for myself, like I always remember what to ask my doctors when I leave the office. So I always want to like send them a text or send them an email or something like that. But most people don't have that kind of relationship with their doctor where they can text their doctor and get an answer.
Or have that kind of access. I mean,
maybe Bill Gates has that, but I don't.
Yeah, maybe Bill Gates. Yeah. Well, and I'll make sort of like my own predictions, which is like I personally don't think ChatGPT is going to make anybody unemployed in the next 50 years. If anything, I kind of see this like, okay, like when I looked at Dr. Gupta, I kind of feel like this is similar to when computers were introduced to libraries. Like librarians were freaking out and they're like, we're going to lose our jobs and everything. It actually created more librarian jobs,
Absolutely.
And if anything, I think Dr. Gupta will allow doctors to focus on tackling challenges that they're more interested in doing versus like there's just a lot of minutia that, and the way the healthcare system has solved for this is like, okay, let's just employ more PAs and nurse practitioners and nurses and stuff, so on and so forth. But like if you're out in the middle of nowhere, or like, look, I live in SoCal. Sometimes I want to go get an appointment with my primary care. It could take me like 2 months, and I'm like, I don't have 2 months.
Really? 2 months?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I was trying to get a new doctor. So specifically, I was trying to get an appointment with a cardiologist, and the one that I wanted, they're like, we don't have an opening for like 2 months, and I'm like, great.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable. Nobody has anything good to say about the doctor experience, right? It's like the worst experience in the world. If you grew up like I did, our parents would take us to the emergency room. Right?
Oh, it's smart. That's a shortcut. Shortcut to a doctor, actually.
Is a place where the urban community often will go as a last resort. And if you don't speak English, right? You and I are lucky. If you don't speak English and you go see a doctor, you don't get treated that great. If you're like, I had a family member recently go to the doctor and English isn't their first language, and they felt like they were dismissed. They felt like their questions were not important. And, I think a lot of people of color have the same issue. People who don't speak English as a first language, people don't speak English at all. Their healthcare is much worse than anyone else's. People who aren't in America, everyone I've talked to who has criticism of Dr. Gupta, I asked them, well, what do we do about the guy in Iran? The government of Iran reached out to us. Like, there are
really?
countries, New Zealand and the UK and other countries reached out to us as well, asking like, well, can we deploy this nationwide? Is there a way to to do this, because if you can cut, like you said, that 5%, the worst 5% of the, I got to say this politely, the most wasteful kind of doctor inquiries, like I'm sniffling, should I go to the doctor and get an antibiotic? Maybe stay at home and wait a couple days. If you get better, it sounds like you got a cold, which is exactly what a doctor would tell you 99 times out of 100. I have this rash on my neck. Is that something to be worried about? And of course, it's a good idea to see a dermatologist, but I think there's a lot of we use healthcare utilization is often wasteful. In fact, probably half of healthcare utilization is completely wasteful. And that, other countries do this by rationing health and limiting access to healthcare and limiting information. But a lot of the reason healthcare is wasteful is because there's a lack of information. What large language models do is they compress the whole internet into this little box, and you can retrieve from the box a real answer, as opposed to Google, where the indexing search method is great. We've used it for so many years, but I think Google's going to go the way of the dinosaur, because on Google, if you said, well, what are the key symptoms of psoriasis? Well, Google's going to look for
everything leads to cancer. Like we had this joke when I was in medical school where we're studying a new section. It's like, oh man, like I think I have cancer. It's
Right.
just like, so kind of like the WebMD effect.
Yeah, Google will give you a web page, probably from WebMD or whatever, whoever's hacked the SEO game. They'll give you a web page, and the web page you hope will be relevant to you. But the problem is it'll be like, okay, 10 symptoms of psoriasis. But if your question is, well, I take steroids because I have this other thing. What about me? Well, Google doesn't have a search engine for you, right? But the LLM has all that information in one, and it has these like almost remarkable like properties to be able to give you like really distinct advice. So like I fed it some of the New England Journal case studies that come out every week, the sort of clinical mysteries, and was able to like come up with like the most incredible answers. So I was surprised. I started it because when GPT's API came out, I said, let me try this. And one of the first things that came to mind was, let me give it some medical questions and see if it'll.
What were you doing? I was gonna say, what were you doing at the time? Because like, so Dr. Jup, it's a company. You guys are, that you can use it for free to a certain extent, and then after that, I think it's like $20 a month. But prior to that, like, what the hell were you doing? Because you just left prison, like you're hanging out. What were you doing that you're like, this is the company I'm going to start next? Because like that's a hell of a risk, right? Because like your backers is like hedge funds and pharma, so like how and why? I have so many questions.
I love software. When I was a kid, I programmed all day and all night, and I never programmed in a professional environment. When I was arrested, I actually took some time off, and I said, I'm going to prepare for my case. I'm going to quit my drug companies, and I'm going to let them manage themselves. And in my spare time, I picked up, sort of more professional programming, and I really fell in love with my kind of original love, which was software. So I was messing around with all kinds of different software. And then when GPT came out, it was kind of like this revolution. It was just, trying to talk to machines for the last 30 something years, and having for the first time, they start talking back. It's like, it's almost like that movie Contact or something. It's like you say hi to the computer. Normally the way you get it to respond would be something like, well, if the user says hi, say hello, and then if the user says hi, but they misspell it, the machine says error. But with LLMs, like I've programmed so many different unique LLMs that, they're really remarkable. I think that physicians that don't rely much on medical testing, like a psychiatrist, for example, is probably the best place to start with something like Gupta, because, a psychiatrist doesn't take your blood levels. A psychiatrist doesn't physically examine you. If they're doing that, they're probably going to lose their license soon. I think that most of the time a psychiatrist just talks to you and says, I think this patient has this, that.
So are you saying like, because that's very interesting angle, because I have a large like physician audience that listens. Like, so aside from patients, your suggestion is that like physicians should actually go and use Dr. Gupta. I guess if you're feeding it all this information, I mean, there's millions of papers on PubMed, and there's no, like, this is the one thing, like when I left medical school, I remember thinking about this like 10 years ago. I was like, how is it that you can just keep up? Because even back, every physician would, they would always say, they're like, look, and it was actually a thing that they told us in our second year, like, look, by the time you graduate medical school, like 50% of the things you're going to learn is going to be antiquated. 50%? And I was like, how do we overcome that? It's like, well, there's, you do continuing medical education, conferences. I'm like, that's not gonna, I don't know if that's gonna keep up with like the hours of studying I was putting in every single day. And I think like back then it was just sort of like sort of a collective consciousness where it's like, you have all these minds working and studying papers and everything, and then you go together at the like one annual conference and talk about it, present, everybody gets up to date, and you leave. But the world's changed. There's just like more stuff, more information. There's more like mental illnesses. Like 15 years ago, we didn't have social media the way we do today. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure there's all kinds of pathologies that are a result of Instagram that we don't talk about.
Yeah, it's impossible to keep up. I mean, imagine being a dermatologist, and do you have time to go to the 20 major dermatology conferences? Do you have time to read the 30 different journals? Do you have time to? I mean, it's really.
Do you feel like this is the reason why like healthcare got more expensive? Because the way that we would solve for this is it's almost like Naval Ravikant has these like four forms of leverage, like labor, capital, media, and code. And before we had media and code, like the idea is like, okay, well, it's too difficult to know all this as a single dermatologist. So like, let's have specialties and subspecialties. Like that's how we solve for this. But now we have code, and this is where like the big shift. Do you feel like that's the right way to think about it?
I do. I mean, I think that normally labor markets will adjust to reflect demand. We demand more and more healthcare, but if you actually look at the number of doctors graduating, we don't have the supply to keep up with that. And the question is, why not?
And why is that? Yeah, I was gonna say, why is that?
I have a cynical idea, right? And it's that, if you keep a supply artificially low, we all know what happens to price, which is that it remains very, very high, and that we could easily graduate, double the amount of doctors that we graduate now. But, of course, the AMA and others would say, well, what about the quality? The quality will be much worse. And while I understand that, I also point you to the fact that, in JAMA recently, GPT's answers were rated as good by blinded physician group, as good as real doctors. And the bedside manner was also rated higher. So
that was the part that blew my mind when I saw that the bedside manner was like rated really high. It's like, because that's kind of like the one pushback with AI. It's like, well, you always want the human touch, but it's like, well, unless you can train it on human touch, then it's just going to be that much better.
If you get the good human touch, I get treated like a rock star when I go to the doctor. But the problem is, if you are not treated like a rock star, you're treated like dirt, which some people are, and it's an inconvenient truth, but some people fear going to the doctor. I know there's a lot of minorities that don't love going to the doctor because they feel like it's a system that is rigged against them, or it's not really for them. And I think that you see well-established evidence of that. And then again, if you don't speak English really well, the doctor kind of looks at you and says, well, this is somebody I don't need to, sort of take seriously. And even though maybe 1 out of 10 doctors do that, if that, it still leaves such a bad taste in people's mouth. GPT doesn't know what you look like. GPT doesn't care, right? It's this really nice kind of neutral thing. And again, it doesn't have to be the answer for everything. I think that, my vision of there not being doctors is a long-term vision. I think that as we get like entire labs that we could fit on a chip, like a Dexcom for everything, not just insulin, one day maybe we'll have that where you can hit your iPhone and check your hemoglobin or check your whatever.
My God.
I
would pay for that in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Like this, like again, like talking about people's demand for healthcare. So I'm sure you've noticed it, but like in the last few years, all these independent, like cash only blood testing facilities, like everybody, like even including me, like I'm looking for a place where I can test my blood, quarterly even, like people were all about it. People were buying, and this is the part where I was like, wow, like healthcare is the place to be. Like my like narrow-minded, some of my friends who are a little bit narrow-minded about tech, and they're like, oh dude, why are you going back to med tech? Like, why don't you stay in tech and SaaS? I'm like, dude, like, look, we're living in a world where on Instagram, I'm seeing ads. I forgot what it's called, but essentially the device that you can stick to your arm, just like usually it's for insulin, but this is like just to monitor your blood, and it kind of tells you like your insulin spike for certain foods. Normal people are paying $200-300 a month cash for this information.
Yeah,
no like it's wild.
We're going to see more and more huge innovations like that.
So I'm going to fast forward. Well, let's say it's so today it's 2023. Let's fast forward to 2060. Okay. So 2060, I don't know. I'm not so good with math in my head, but you and I are older. Okay. We're hanging out. We're doing another podcast, and millions of people are using Dr. Gupta, right? And Dr. Gupta has made like an actual impact on healthcare. What does that workflow look like? So let's say I'm a patient in, just some city, and I have a stomach ache, right? what's the workflow look like for that patient if Dr. Gupta has this big impact and is used by millions?
Well, it's certainly a fantasy looking 40 years into the future, but I do think, like, whether it's an iPhone or an app, and I can abstract my own brand away from this, like, I think there'll be a computer that will be able to monitor your health in really granular detail, real time. It'll also be able to monitor things like the different mutations that are happening in your cells. For example, this is already happening with liquid biopsy. We're I think going to take that product from Grail, which is probably the next great medtech company, say once a year.
You think Grail's the next great medtech company?
I do. I mean, there are a number of similar companies that are public, but I think the idea that you can take this biopsy every year pretty painlessly and determine if you potentially have cancer is an incredible thing. So finding the clonality of these cells and kind of like if there's a mutation there is something we may be able to do in an automatic way, where we sort of have, each of us has like a Dexcom attached to us, and there's a mini lab kind of in the Dexcom, and you can look real time. Not that you would need to, but you can look real time at things like cholesterol and other, important metabolic panels. And then you'll have that interpretation immediately with something like Dr. Gupta or another AI tool that emails you and says, hey, Omar, your LDL is starting to get into worrisome territory. Can you consider maybe cutting back on? And it knows what you ate and all that stuff, and says so forth.
Yeah,
I think that's the world we're gonna live in at some point.
And just kind of expand on that. Like, look, just as an example. I mean, funny enough, and we didn't talk about this, but like I do have some issues with my cholesterol, right? And so there's a period like last year where I am on some cholesterol medication, but there's a point where I was like full on carnivore. Like I was eating like eggs in the morning. I was eating like liver, heart, and like I was eating a lot of red meat. I think red meat's very good for you, but like not the quantities I was eating last year. And then like I went to my doctor, we got some blood drawn, it came back, my triglycerides, everything was out of whack. So like give or take, it was a solid 30 to 60 days for me to get those tests, execute them, get it back, say, okay, I got to make some changes and make those changes versus like, I mean, and I'm a healthy guy, like 30, 60 days is a long time. And for the average person, it might've been longer because maybe a lot of people, like, especially men are really bad about like usually most men, especially minority men, as a token brown guy, minority men usually don't go to the doctor ever unless they're like literally dying.
Yep.
And so I think like these kind of advents with technology, can serve as a nudge to make the behavior changes, right? Well before, let's say, pharmaceutical drugs are needed. And I think that's like probably one of the more exciting things. That was kind of the thing that I saw with Dr. Gupta, which, by the way, can I share you? I'll share with you. I was considering whether I should share or not. I'll share with you my patient story with Dr. Gupta. It's just because this has just happened last night. So last night, my son, who's a little over a year old, had a really bad fever. Okay. Now, having been through medical school, knowing my son, I knew what it was, but I was like, at that time, like, I was like, we got him taken care of, but I was like, let me go to Dr. Gupta and I just want to see.
You see the sweat dripping down my forehead, even though we've had hundreds of thousands of users. I'm still nervous.
So I went to Dr. Gupta and I was like, okay, I'm going to put this to the test now and see like if this is legit, because like I already went through the medical workflow in my head and it worked. And so I went through it and told Dr. Gupta, I'm like, hey, my son is this old. And I pretended to be like an actual like patient. Like, I'm not going to think of all these like fancy. I'm like, hey, I have a 13-month-old baby and he's really hot. What do I do? And within like a few answers, it went through a really good workflow and kind of gave me some ideas of what it could be. Right. And then what it suggested I should do was exactly what I ended up doing, like prior to going to Dr. Gupta. Like I ended up giving him ibuprofen, right? But it was really good. And like within a couple minutes, I had that answer. And what was remarkable, what I was thinking, I was like, okay, if I took myself, again, as somebody who didn't go to medical school, doesn't know anything about medicine, and did what most people do these days, which is they just go to Google, right? So I went to Google and put the same thing. It was a mess. Right. And if anything, like I was thinking, I was like, if I was a regular patient, this would have given me a lot more anxiety. And so I was really impressed with, I was impressed with the workflow of Dr. Again, I just used it that one time, but like it was good. It served its purpose.
I'm obviously overjoyed with that, but I'd also like consider the fact that like you're a brilliant guy, you went through med school. Think about the guy who isn't brilliant, right? Think about the
Yeah,
woman.
exactly.
Think
Yeah,
about the person
exactly.
that only speaks Spanish. You know, that's where
Because
this
LLMs
really,
are trained in all languages. Yeah,
they speak all
actually,
the languages. We've tried
I
almost
should
all
have
of them.
my yeah, I should, you know what, I should have my wife later try it also in Turkish.
Yeah, we tried
You know,
Turkish. We tested almost every language. There are a few African languages it's not very good at, but in general, like to me, like you and I, like I said, a snarky journalist or somebody that invested $100 million making a symptom checker over the last 5 years, and now is looking at these LLMs that can do 100 times that. You know, there are a lot of snarky people out there that would look at Gupta and say, "Well, you know," have some complaint about it, like, "Well, this should be regulated," or that's not fair. Farmer Bro figured something clever
yeah.
out. I think that
I mean,
the
you
reality
guys
is,
do have a disclaimer where you're like, this is not a real doctor, so on and so forth. But again, like, look, again, I'm trying to look at it from like, I'm a positive guy, and so, and I will say, like, before I reached out to you and everything, like, I did a decent amount of due diligence, and I had my own skepticism about Dr. Gupta, but like, I think it has great potential. Like, look, perfect example, which is like, it's almost textbook, which is appendicitis, right? There's some like textbook things for appendicitis, but for a lot of people, like one of my friends who had appendicitis when we were kids, he was in high school, because I knew about it, right? When I think I was, how old was I? 21, 20 years old. And he had appendicitis, and he was telling me, he's like, dude, he's like, I have this pain here. It hurts a lot. And again, I was wanting to go to medical school. So my dad's a general surgeon. And had I not told him, like, dude, I think you have an appendicitis. We should go talk to my dad. Long story short, we went to my dad. My dad's like, this is we need to go to surgery now. We went to surgery. My dad peeled back the fascia, and it was like a lot of us. Like, he would have died. He would have gone septic and died. And seeing something like Dr. Gupta, I think, how many people out there, like some guys working out in the field, or just your average Joe, has appendicitis, is hurting, right? And it's just like, oh, I probably had like some bad food, or I just have gas. They take, like, I don't know, some Tums, this is like Tums and everything, and it gets worse, and they go septic and die.
yeah,
Right? Versus, like, if you go to Dr. Group, just like some simple prompts, like, it will tell you, like, this is appendicitis, you need to go to the emergency room.
yeah. And we're working hard to improve Dr. Gupta. For example, like we spent the last several weeks working on speech to text, text to speech, so full loop speech, so you don't ever have to type anything to Dr. Gupta. So I think that's
great.
Yeah, it's going to help a lot. I don't know when we'll roll it out, but I think pretty soon. I think it's going to help the average person who really needs healthcare is not the 25-year-old journalist or the 40-year-old sort of medtech entrepreneur. It's the 65-year-old who is maybe not the most computer savvy, doesn't want to sit there and peck away at a chat all day. And I think that we're going to try really hard to make that easier. We're adding therapists at some point soon. So I think therapy is one of these things that, is even kind of, it's harder technologically actually, but it's easier from a patient interaction kind of thing. Obviously, there are some cases like oncology where I'm not sure Dr. Gupta is going to help you that much other than be a good well of information. But, issues like that where you're really relying on MRIs or CAT scans or other like blood data, Gupta can work with you, but it's really just going to be a second opinion. You need a real doctor to examine you. But things like psychotherapy, which is sort of, it is medicine in a way, but it's this very, kind of different part of medicine. Many people, like we mentioned, men really don't like going to therapy, and more men should. I wish I went to therapy years ago. There are a lot of issues that we do need to work out, men, women, everyone. And therapy can be very much stigmatized. It can be very expensive. It's often not covered by insurance. It's very difficult to go to therapy. If you're depressed, you don't want to do anything, let alone walk over and schlep to a therapist and lie down.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think there's going to be a lot of potential there. I think nutrition and diet, which we often forget about, is part of medicine. And most doctors feel like they're kind of above that. I think that's something that can be really valuable here. So I like the whole idea of having like this panel of AI health experts to help you. And of course, we may one day integrate physicians into Dr. Gupta, where Dr. Gupta really thinks that you need to see an actual physician. Maybe you can press a button and